So welcome to Regional Resilience in Action. We have a wonderful panel tonight of people who are working on the issue of resilience every day, and I would love to introduce them to you now. Elizabeth Payne, Beth Payne, she's the CEO of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. And for each introduction, I would love the panelists to tell us, what is your role? What do you do day in and day out? So Beth, we'll start with you.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. My name is Beth Payne, and like Jessica said, I'm the CEO of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. So I'm sure many of you don't know what that organization is, and we're a regional government agency, one of 10 in the state of Florida, and we cover 7 counties in Northeast Florida. And we do kind of a myriad of things, resiliency included, but also economic development and growth management and emergency preparedness.
Okay. Next, we have Jessica Beach, the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of St. Augustine. Welcome, Jessica.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here. So as Jessica had mentioned, I'm the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of St. Augustine. We're a small community. I actually wear many hats. I'm also the city's stormwater engineer and also Deputy Director for Public Works and Utilities. So it's very busy, and day in and day out, I deal with flooding and all the things that go with that. And this is a busy time of year with hurricanes and high king tides and whatnot, but it's never a dull moment.
All right, and then Ann Coglianese, the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Jacksonville, is here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ann Coglianese, and as CRO for the City of Jacksonville, I'm really looking at long-term climate impacts and how they will be felt here in Jacksonville. So like Jessica, a lot of my work looks at flooding, how flooding trends are changing, where that flood extent is going to be now and in the future. But we're also looking at heat and other major temperature changes that we're seeing as a result of climate change.
And last, we have Ashantae Green, who's the Sustainability Manager with the City of Jacksonville.
Good evening, everyone. Like she said, I'm Ashantae Green, the Sustainability Manager for the City of Jacksonville. I'm almost at my 1-year anniversary with the city. So I really focused on the other side of resilience with sustainability, how we can actually address the causes of climate change. So I look specifically at some of initiatives that the city is putting forth to deploy more clean energy, EV charging, and also about sustainability and efficiency with our public facilities, as well as education and environmental stewardship within the community.
Great. So we will go through a little show and tell from each of our panelists. We're going to start with Beth for an update on the Regional Resilience Plan that is being developed. Take it away.
Right, so I think really what's important, there will be some slides behind me, but I'm just gonna kind of tell you about the process that we went through. I think something that is important to note is that regional collaboration on resiliency is kind of a nationwide best practice and a statewide best practice. So because of that, the staff at the Regional Council created Resilient First Coast. So that's our regional collaborative, which encompasses our 7 counties in Northeast Florida. So that's an organization made up of all sorts of members, dozens and dozens of subject matter experts who come together to plan for regional resiliency actions. And so it's led by a steering committee, of which we have some members on this stage who are members of our steering committee, and then Jessica Beach is the co-chair of our collaborative. So really it's involved in supporting our local governments in their resiliency efforts, but then leveraging resources and best practices and knowledge sharing. So just know that that is a part of Northeast Florida, and you can see there's an icon and a website for that. So this past year, the collaborative undertook, oh, thank you, a regional resiliency action plan. And so again, that's really to come together, and a lot of planning is about the process. So it was really bringing together members of the collaborative and subject matter experts across a multidisciplinary field to discuss ways that we can protect local and regional assets from the impacts of climate change. So that's all the things that these ladies have talked about. We just look at it kind of on a bigger scale and how we can work together and support what's happening locally at a larger scale. So That took almost a year to do collaboratively through committees, through subject matter experts, and then it was brought to the full collaborative for a final review. And so we're happy to say that phase 1 is complete. And so it really was broken down by the 4 pillars of our collaborative itself, which is the environment, infrastructure, economic resilience, and quality of life. So that's some of the subject matter that's covered. But what's important is that it not only sets a voluntary policy framework, but it also kind of encourages our local governments to think on larger scale measures that maybe they can implement together. So whether that's, grant applications for different things, whether that's wholesale changes as it comes to building standards to build more resiliently, or infrastructure changes, or leveraging things to protect our natural ecosystems and disaster preparedness. So it really is like a high-level look at things that can be done to improve the resiliency of our region. And I can't go without the last slide, which kind of shows all of our partners and all the hard work that went into this. We're excited to start on phase 2 shortly, which is going to be more implementation and action-oriented. So that will happen hopefully over the next year. But we're really excited that this is out there, that our partners are continuing to come together, and that we can kind of help support all the work that's being done that you'll hear about in a regional way.
Thank you, Beth.
Sure.
So this question is a question from a reader for Jessica. Mina V says, my question is, how do newcomers to this area learn about climate issues surrounding the region and how they can be a part of these endeavors? Is there something that individuals can do on a daily basis to raise awareness or contribute towards resilience efforts, and any resources that citizens can use as a guide on their journey? So this is a good introduction to your presentation on efforts in St. Augustine.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's a big part of what we did in the beginning. I have one of their support staff that helps me. We get lots of questions from our community through public meetings and projects. And so one of the first things we did was dedicate time to overhaul our website. And we've been collecting a lot of resources and putting it on there. And because we're getting similar questions, we're trying to educate our community on the flood risks and answer those general questions, because we have capital projects going on, we have studies going on. But the big thing is educating our community and empowering them to make decisions for themselves on what they may be able to do for their property. There's a lot of cases within the city where homeowners have gone on their own efforts and they're retrofitting their houses, they're lifting, they're buying floodgates, they're building ring walls around their properties. They're doing that kind of independent of the city while we're working on some larger scale type of projects. These are individual property owners trying to protect their property. So we're seeing that kind of transpire in real time. And so this is one of our websites, and it's what we try to make a one-stop shop for residents, and it's actually been very helpful. This is not just limited to the city of St. Augustine, although I will say we are unique with our architecture and our historic buildings and our archaeological resources, and so we do have some specific resources that are geared towards that as well. And also, this slide here talks about the resilient heritage in a study that we completed not too long ago, and there's some really good resources in there, and it's not just specific for historic properties, although that was the primary purpose for the study, but it's things that can be done for any type of property that might be flood prone. And then this is one of the programs that we participate in with FEMA. So they have a flood mitigation assistance program. It's an annual program that's offered, and it's specifically to lifting properties that are repetitive or severe repetitive loss. And that program, we're in our 4th year of submitting for that. We actually have 60 properties that are queued up to receive funding from FEMA. And so we're going to be implementing that program. There's a lot that goes into that. That's like a whole nother topic for another day. But just so you're aware, this is federally cost-shared funding. So for a homeowner, at a minimum, they're looking at a 75%, 25% cost share to lift that home. So if it takes $100,000 to lift, FEMA's kicking in 75% of that, and the homeowner is paying 25%. So that's a big incentive, because it is expensive to lift, and that's not the actual cost, but that's just to make the math very simple. And we actually have a lot of properties within the city limits that have already lifted, and it's been independent financing. They have not gone through the FEMA's federal program, it's a very long process. So caveats with that too, but those are just some of the examples of things that we're doing within the city. Oh, oh, and don't let me forget my studies. So we have one of the two big studies that were underway. We have one with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we're actually wrapping up a vulnerability assessment. So as Beth was talking about at a regional level, many of the counties that are within the Northeast Florida Regional Council are completing these vulnerability assessments, and we are wrapping ours up. Our deliverable deadline's tomorrow, and I was just looking through the report this morning, but the information in that's really helpful because it's looking at flood risk for critical assets and why that may not help a homeowner. It can look at roads, or if you want to flush your toilet, we're looking at our sanitary sewer system, we're looking at our water treatment plants. And so this vulnerability assessment's been a really important step to update what we've already been known for flood risks. And so that helps roadmap. It identifies projects. We can then cost share funding with the state potentially to implement these projects. And so that's a smaller scale study. And in conjunction with that, in parallel, we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers and looking citywide comprehensively at options that we can do for reducing our coastal storm risk. And so that study is on a little bit longer time track, but this little slide behind me kind of shows a little bit of that too. And there, I think, collaboration that Beth had mentioned is actually really important. And so within the city, we have federal, state, and local, and a really good example of that, of all these entities coming together is along our bayfront. So for most of you that are familiar with St. Augustine and the fort, that's federally owned property. If you go south towards the Bridge of Lions, that's state-owned with the seawall, the Department of Transportation, and then you transition into city-owned property. So we're actually working very closely with our state and federal partners on ways that we can better improve our bayfront. And so that's just an example of how collaboration is really, really important for us. I think that's it. Oh, that's all the other things. We have lots of projects, and we've got a lot of funding that we've been leveraged to make that happen. And with that, I will pass that on to Anne.
So Anne, before you get started, congratulations are in order because the city was just awarded a national honor from the American Planning Association for your sustainability efforts because of the Resilient Jacksonville plan, which we unveiled on this very stage a year ago, I believe. So congratulations on that. And why do you think this effort stands out nationally above others?
Yeah, well, thank you. We're very honored that the American Planning Association has recognized our Resilient Jacksonville plan from the start of our planning process, which was close to 3 years ago that we started that work. We really recognized that Jacksonville looks very different from other cities that have done resilience plans and that work in this field. It's a massive city with a large and complex hydrologic system, and so we felt it was really important for our resilience planning to be based on the best available sound science and data, and that really permeated every element of the plan. We wanted to make sure we were quantifying a risk, we were showing where that was going to happen, and then we were laying out solutions that were really tailored to the neighborhood. And I think that was the other piece that APA really picked up on. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just writing a plan for, let's say, downtown or areas near town center that are kind of contemporary suburbs popping up, or large subdivisions going in on the west side. We really felt that we needed to make sure we had actions that could be deployed for all the different development types that we find in our city. So those are some of the kind of unique elements. Resilience can be a bit of a buzzword, so I see some familiar faces out here, and if you've ever heard me speak before, you know that this slide is always one of the first things I share, because I think it's important to note that the work I do and Jessica do and we all are really working on is how can city systems be changing dynamics for residents? So taking the pressure off of individuals to have to weather these really big changes, and instead making sure that the roadway networks and the services that they rely on are safe and secure regardless of a shock like a hurricane or stresses like sea level rise or extreme heat. So this is just a little a brief overview of the Resilience strategy. I will note we didn't have enough copies to put one on each table, but some of the tables have kind of a thicker version of our strategy. If you want to flip through that, great. If your table is done flipping through it and you want to pass it to another table so others can look at it, fabulous. And hopefully after the event, if folks are wanting to look through it in more detail, they can go up to one of the tables that has it. But what you will find on every table is an update. Last week we launched a one-year annual update. We felt it was really important to be transparent with the community about the fact that we didn't just write this plan and then have it sit on a shelf. This is something that we're actively implementing. And one of the challenges for me tonight was just trying to highlight a couple of the items in it. You'll notice that we outlined 4 key projects that we're working on, but I wanted to share a couple of visuals about one of those, and that is a compound flood model that we've been building with a team of experts out of Louisiana. Compound flooding is one of the most common types of flooding we experience here in Jacksonville, and it's when a coastal system meets a riverine system or a rainfall system. And so the interplay between the St. Johns River and its many tributaries and our ocean system can cause flooding to be multiplied here in Jacksonville. And that's been very challenging to model in the past, but we have a really cutting-edge approach that we're using. And so this is just one screen grab out of one of our combined model runs. And so if you know anything about the Springfield neighborhood and Hogan's Creek, you'll know that this is an area that sees a lot of repetitive flood challenges. And we now have a way of looking at how that creek flooding in Hogan's Creek is really exacerbated by both tidal and rainfall events. But the thing that's really interesting about our model is actually this area that's circled, this idea of having a way to now visually capture where we're going to have rainfall-induced flooding. A lot of our flood models that we rely on from FEMA and NOAA and other federal sources are really only capturing water. They're making a lot of assumptions that water is efficiently moving into a drainage basin, but we know that we have little pockets where rainfall just sits and it starts to fill up our streets and our sidewalks. And so one of the things we're hoping this modeling effort will be able to do is really support better project design and also better city planning and zoning, and making sure that we're building in the places that we can quantify now as the lowest risk of having a flood intervention. And in the areas where we are seeing roads or neighborhoods impacted by flooding, how can we use open space and also our public right-of-way to be capturing more flooding? And so this is just an example graphic of the ways in which we have a lot of opportunities in our streetscape to both capture stormwater and also cool our communities and beautify them with natural resources like trees and open space.
I do want to stay with you for a moment, Anne, and turn to some questions from readers. So in your plan, and speaking of things that resilience is and resilience isn't, right? In your plan, you talk about land development regulations, urban forestry management, extreme temperature, compound flood model, all of these project areas. Specifically in the land development regulations area, Kelly P., a reader, says, I live off Broward Road, and recently a coastal tract of land was clear-cut for development in what is absolutely a flood zone. What power does the resiliency arm of the city have to deny permits for development in areas identified as most subject to the impact of rising sea levels?
It's a good question, and it's something I get asked a lot. The short, not complex answer is zero. I have zero power in the permitting process directly. I'm not a stamp in the process, and I shouldn't be. The Resilience Office is really there to be an innovation arm of the city. So what we are doing is we're working actively with the planning department to revise the regulations that they use to implement permitting. And that's really the function that the Resilience Office plays. So it's not a direct role, it's indirect, but it allows us to take science, like what we're seeing from the compound flood model, and fold it into more creative land development regs. And we're actively working on this with an advisory committee made up of representatives from the development community, environmental advocates, housing advocates, and we've been able to look at our compound flood data and look at all of the many areas of our city that aren't lighting up on our flood maps. There's a lot of high and dry land in Jacksonville, and what we want to do is drive development into those areas. And so We have proposed a scorecard structure, and we're actively revising that, and hopefully it'll go through a council process in early 2025 for adoption. But the goal of this scorecard is if developers are building in more resilient ways, planting trees, incorporating bioretention, incorporating energy efficiency, and other kind of smart and green building elements, they can accrue points in a scorecard that then allow them to qualify for increased density, which they like because it makes their developments more profitable. We like because they're being designed in better ways, and we all benefit from having more housing in our city for our growing population and for our already strained affordable housing. So we're really trying to get creative on where we see opportunities for smart and safe development. And then we're also able to look at our compound flood data, and we're looking at expanding the areas where things like base flood elevation requirements might be in place. But certainly, all permits that are going through right now have to meet our floodplain ordinance, and so there are setbacks from our current floodplain. I think where the Resilience Office is trying to provide some innovation is recognizing that a line on a map of a floodplain from FEMA is also, there's science behind it, but it's also a legal designation. And flooding is going to fluctuate and expand on that line. And so how do we proactively see where our future floodplain is going to be and make sure that we're building in smart ways, not just in the floodplain, but in the areas that will eventually become floodplain.
We have one more question from Jim S., another reader, who he expresses a little bit of frustration or impatience with the pace of things. And I wonder if you've been in this job now for about 3 years, Anne. What do you feel that at all, that you wish things could move faster with resilience, infrastructure, or any other efforts?
A resident is impatient? I'm shocked. No, I mean, I think it's honestly one of my favorite things about Jacksonville from the time I've gotten here. I think one of the biggest complaints is, can we do more? Can we do it faster? And I've really appreciated having those champions. They allow me to have advocates out there that provide space for me to do this work. And I think it is a challenge to sometimes get people to see how fundamental it is to put building blocks in place. Having the best data allows us to structure better policies, better projects, and better programs, and that allows us to have a higher rate of success. So I can see how you want to jump to a certain outcome, but it's really important to show our work as the city. This is a topic that we probably have a lot of people in the room who, see the impacts of climate change, how urgent it is. That's not everyone in our community, and so it benefits the work to bring people along and to be able to show what data and science is indicating and how that's a foundation for the decisions we're making. The city also has, really important kind of financial metrics that we have to do, and so having that data in place allows us to show our work and have that public-facing accountability. So I know that is sometimes a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard pill for me to swallow too, because sometimes you just want to jump in and do something that intuitively you think is right, but we have to show that empirically that's the right step for our city.
Okay. Let's move on for now to Ashantae and the Regional Climate Action Plan, and tell us what that is and how people can get involved.
Yes, so the city of Jacksonville received a $1 million EPA grant last year to develop a regional climate action plan. That's not only for the city of Jacksonville, but it's for surrounding counties and cities within them. St. Augustine is involved. We're working very closely with Nefercy, St. Johns County, Clay County, Nassau County, the city of Palm Coast, and I feel like I'm missing one other county, Duval County, of course, and all of our beaches cities as well. So pretty much what a regional climate action plan is, number one, it develops a baseline for greenhouse gases within the region. So we've developed the first community-wide greenhouse gas inventory. So that pretty much tells a baseline of where we are, where the greenhouse gases are coming from. We actually know where they're coming from. and we're able to develop measures, projects, programs, policies that will help reduce those greenhouse gas measures. So the Climate Action Plan is my baby at the city. It's one of many things I'm working on, but I'm really excited to actually work with the community. We have a number of stakeholders involved. We have sector roundtables. We've had over 100 people engaged and subject matter experts from around the region sharing best management practices. And we're also working with other cities around the nation that's doing the same work. So I did also want to start with, what is sustainability? We talk a lot about resilience, and those of you in the audience that know me, I'm the green lady in the city. But in essence, sustainability really looks at that three-pronged stool, the people, planet. Some people say profit, some people say prosperity. So in my role, I'm really looking at how all of those circles work together and how it impacts the environment, but also how it impacts the health of people. So dialing back into the Regional Climate Action Plan, oftentimes when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, it's very easy to think about energy. It's very easy to think about factories because you see the gray smoke going into the air, right? But in reality, we're looking at solutions from every single sector possible. So looking at waste and materials, methane from our landfill is a major issue that not only impacts the environment, but health of folks around. Agriculture on working lands can be a emitter of greenhouse gases, but there's a huge opportunity to create carbon sinks that will draw down carbon and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and hold them in place. Industry sector, Jacksonville is an industry city. We have the 10th largest port in, I think, the world. And there's so much logistics that goes in and out of our city as well as our region. So we have to really be mindful about ensuring that we're working with our industry partners and educating them on how they can be more sustainable with their practices, from waste to energy to the types of equipment they use, or even from post-consumer, how they're promoting different programs that can encourage waste to not go into the landfill. Residential buildings, commercial buildings, transportation, and power generation, we're looking at those as well. So when I started November of last year, the EPA, one thing about the EPA, they love acronyms and deadlines. So the CPRG grant has many deliverables. The first was developing a baseline greenhouse gas inventory and a priority climate action plan. So we hustled, and it was a team effort. We hustled, I think we got the greenhouse gas inventory done in about 2 months. And this is a first snapshot of what greenhouse gases look like in our region. You'll notice the blue area, the dark blue, is transportation. And believe it or not, that is actually the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in our region. Think about it. The scale of our city, raise your hand if you have a car. Okay, I should see more hands out there. But we're looking at strategies to work very closely, with our bike ped community, as well as supporting the department within our neighborhood to make sure that it's safe for folks that want to choose bicycles, as well as working very closely with JTA as well as other partners to increase multimodal transportation. The second emitter of greenhouse gases is our buildings. We spend so much of our time in buildings, and it's very, very important that we build them in a sustainable way. So the materials that we use for buildings, they create carbon, they come from carbon, and there are a lot of things we can do to rectify that. In essence, the Regional Climate Action Plan, we published the PCAP, the Priority Climate Action Plan, April of this year. you can scan that QR code to go to the website. We created a semi-informal coalition called Clean Air Northeast Florida with all of the stakeholders within the region working together in partnership with Nefercy to take us further to develop the first regional comprehensive climate action plan. And there are still opportunities to get involved. I did want to give a shout out to some of our co-chairs that I see in the audience that are leading our sector roundtables. So scan that, go to the Get Involved page. We're having monthly meetings. You can literally look at hundreds of measures that we've gotten from the EPA and other partners and help us figure out what we can really do in our region and get it done.
And what is the end result of this whole process? When you get to the end, are you giving this to local governments to say, here are some ideas for things you might want to implement? What happens next?
Yeah, so in addition to being in compliance with the EPA grant, number one, it makes us grant ready for other opportunities. Anyone heard of the Inflation Reduction Act? There is billions upon billions of dollars out there for climate strategies for mitigation as well as adaptation, and having a baseline greenhouse gas inventory. Having a climate action plan is normally one of those things you have to qualify for some of those grant opportunities. So number one, it's making it municipalities within our region grant ready, but it's also pointing to measures that have been vetted that can actually be implemented. That way we're not scrambling to develop a plan for ideas when opportunities arise. And another thing too is just making sure that people within the community are also aware of different things you can take advantage of. There are a number of federal tax credits. There are a number of just opportunities out there for you guys if you want to make your homes more energy efficient, if you want to buy an electric vehicle, as well as a lot of things. So definitely scan that QR code. It's a lot of resources there, and we hope to publish the comprehensive climate action plan by December of next year. So we really need your help and engagement.
Thank you. Okay, so can you just go to the next slide? Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to go back to a reader question that panelists might want to answer. So Chris H. asks, assuming that you plan for worst case scenarios, one of which is sea level rise of 20 feet by the end of the century if carbon emissions are not drastically reduced, what is your plan for that? So this idea of planning for worst case scenarios versus what's most likely, I assume that's something that you have to balance all the time in your planning. And Jessica, you were just talking about building a wall along the waterfront in St. Augustine. How are you thinking about worst case versus most likely in that case?
So I think that's where the planning comes into play, and like Anne had mentioned earlier, the data, we have to rely on that data to drive some of the decisions. So with the studies that we have going on for the vulnerability assessment, it's being guided by the state. So there's actually statutes that guide for planning horizons and what sea level rise curves to look at. So the results from our initial vulnerability assessment are taking those into account. And it is hard from like a planning perspective because there is a range and you have to look at what you're trying to protect against. And so for example, looking at critical infrastructure as a wastewater treatment facility, we're probably going to be look more stringent at design standards for that than we might some other type of critical asset. So it is going to vary for that. And with the Army Corps back-based study, they are looking at a range of sea level rise scenarios, and they actually do a simulation of coastal storm models. And Anne had also touched on compound flooding. And so that's another thing that has to be taken into consideration. So then the strategies that come out of that, and it ranges the structural, like you had mentioned, walls and levees, pump stations, floodgates, but then there's also non-structural, where we're lifting properties or flood proofing, and then our natural and nature-based features where we can enhance and protect some of the things that are already working for us, like our dune systems and wetland restoration and marsh habitat and things of that nature. So it's hard to pick an exact number. So I think it depends on what exactly you're trying to protect, and then you have to, there's some guidelines out there already from EPA and other resources that we can rely on to help those decisions. So.
And when you're thinking about those worst case scenarios, is that something where you do think it's just we're going to have to lose something in this scenario? We're not going to be able to protect it all?
Yeah, it's a great question. For the compound flood model, I was kind of talking about it being built and what it's able to do. But one of the pieces I neglected to mention is that we're going to be using a probabilistic mathematic framework to run 10,000 scenarios. So it will be that wild worst case scenario, but then we'll also be plotting these on a probability curve. So we'll know the full range of best case scenario to worst case scenario, but also really that key question, which is what is most likely to occur and what are the different variations of that most likely. I think in many ways the compound flood model is a real important piece of accurately quantifying what that risk could look like, and it advances the science that we have at our fingertips substantially. The other thing I'll say is that what you do with that information can really vary, and so there are parts of our city that are going to see more chronic flooding from extreme high tide events, from the combined impacts of tidal events and high wind events or surge. And so the interventions there look more like what Jessica is talking about in St. Augustine of elevations, or looking at when you have to do major upgrades on an asset, thinking, is this the right place for that asset long term? Or are we looking at higher ground for certain things? So there is a bit of kind of major adaptation, but then there's also, I think, a lot of parts of Jacksonville that are going to be experiencing more chronic disruptions from, let's say, heavy rainfall events. And so there it's less that we need the most robust capital upgrades, but we need more systematic changes in the way we're building out our land, how we're using open space, how we're finding places for rainfall to be temporarily captured during high events, so that it's high rain events, so that it's not causing kind of these chronic disruptions. So we look at the full range of things. And the other piece I'll mention, especially as you're thinking further out, is really doing some consequence analysis and some scenario playing. And so that was a big part of our resilience strategy. And we looked at development patterns over the last 20 years, carried those out into the next 50 years, and then looked at a future floodplain through the lens of a NOAA intermediate high scenario. And we tried to see what that would change about our risk profile. And what we found is that we would have 3 times as many residents living in areas that were vulnerable to flooding, 2.5 times as many assets vulnerable to flooding, and 1.5 times as many residents vulnerable to the impacts of extreme heat. So that was a really powerful and compelling baseline for why we need to build differently, and why our resilience response can't exclusively be looking at our assets today and our risk profile today, because as we continue to have population growth, Jacksonville is looking at over 500,000 new residents in the next 50 years. And so where and how we build is going to be a big factor in that. So certainly looking at the sea level rise and the climate projections is important, but it's also important to layer that with other major decisions that cities make.
What is something, and I'm going to ask each of you on this panel, I kind of made the joke that it was appropriate this conversation was happening the week of Halloween, because this can feel like a scary topic, right? So I want to leave us in this conversation on a high note and ask each of our panelists, what is something that gives you hope from your work?
I would say, I think, we talk a lot about resiliency of things and assets, but I think it's also incredible the resilience of people. I think we've seen recently the storms and how they've impacted, not Florida, who may be more accustomed to dealing with, devastation like that, but as we see it across the country, I think the resilience of people, it gives me hope, but it's also people's connection and commitment to the places that they love and the places that they call home. It's amazing the work that's going on in North Carolina right now, and Tennessee and Virginia and South Carolina, those places that were devastated by the recent storms. And so I constantly am amazed and grateful for those people and their connection to where they live.
I think kind of on that similar note, it can be a bit overwhelming when we were just talking about worst case scenarios and planning, and you look at the flood maps, and for the city of St. Augustine, it's no surprise we're pretty much underwater under a number of scenarios. So you look at the data and it can be a little bit overwhelming, but when you look at our community, I've seen it evolve over the past several years, and each hurricane season, we've gotten better at a community as adapting. And just with the past hurricanes with Helene and Milton, I've seen our business community and I've seen our residents just be proactive, and they're doing what they can to protect their property. And I think kind of to Beth's point, it's the resilience of our community, but also we love living there. You know, my family's multi-generations from there. We live downtown. We're vested in this. We're from the area. You know, we want to stay for the long haul. We want to see the nation's oldest city succeed and be resilient in the long term and for the future. And I think there's a lot of community support for that. So that definitely gives me hope for the hard work that's ahead of us.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has changed for the city's resilience office in the last year, and the biggest is that we've added a lot of staff. And so I think one of the things that makes me hopeful is the people I get to work with every day, and I'm going to brag on two of them who are here. We have Valerie Feinberg, who's a Fuse Fellow in our office and leading an urban forestry management plan, which if I had more time, I could have talked this entire time about that. The idea that we are finally really tackling extreme heat and beautification of our city and tapping folks from outside of government to come in and be embedded for a year, and Valerie's actually staying into a second year to really bring new ideas and innovate. That's amazing. And then Allison Boss, who's a project coordinator on our team, she came up to me at this event 2 years ago and said, I'd love to be an intern. And now she's full-time and actually completed our citywide vulnerability assessment as her student capstone. I think the young people that we're able to interact with either as interns or who are doing thesis or capstone projects and really getting that applied research work, they give me a lot of hope because they are excited and they're driven. And the more that we can bring those like bright minds into government, I think the better government's going to be able to respond. So I feel very fortunate that I get to work with really smart, driven people who care.
Hello. Ann took my answer. But, you know.
Ashantae is one of the colleagues I get to work with too. So.
Definitely, what really gives me hope is definitely, number one, working for an administration and a Mayor Donna Deegan that really prioritizes both resilience and sustainability and truly cares. So that gives me hope every day, as well as colleagues that I work with like Ann and everyone on the stage. Also, I did want to shout out some of my folks, Carly Smith, who's here. She's a sustainability aide. And you all know James Richardson. He's awesome at the city. But definitely one thing that gives me hope, not only at work but at home, is thinking about my son. He's here today. His birthday is on Monday. But in essence, I tell people he's my biggest why, and it's not just him, but it's all of your children and every single person within the city that depends on the work we do to get it right, you know. And I am every day hopeful with that question of, you know, what if we get it right? What if we really implement some of these measures that we know is going to make a true impact? So just our community, the engagement for caring citizens like you that come to this event, you know, after probably a long work day. You guys didn't have to be here, but you took your time to come. So that gives me hope just seeing all of your faces.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. And thank you to all of you for being here. If you have additional questions that you would like to ask our panel, you are welcome to send them right to me. That's my email address, and I can filter those out to the individual panelists, and they can answer you there. Before you go, please fill out a survey that is in front of you on your table. And if you are not already subscribed to our daily Jacksonville Today newsletter, I invite you to sign up at jaxtoday.org, and you'll get free news and information about sustainability efforts and everything else that's going on in Jacksonville, and voting guides that might come in handy. So thank you again, everybody, for being here tonight, and that is our program.